Hello everyone, and welcome to this video on supplier selection types. Please do watch the video on supplier selection frameworks before. These types do fit into a broader framework. They're not standalone alternatives, but rather part of a broader framework. We have 5 general supplier selection types here: open, restricted, negotiated, competitive dialogue, and framework agreement. Of particular interest to those who are involved in public sector procurement is the requirement for particular types dependent on the size of the value of the contract being awarded or the general type, so the industry or type of procurement process may actually mandate one of these. As we're currently in the midst of a fairly messy divorce from the EU, that may be changing relatively soon. So what we're going to do is just go through each of these 5 types and take a look at the purpose of each of them, when they should be used, as well as the broad outlines. It's useful to remember that these are just generic types and there are lots of variants possible, as well as special customized supplier selection types for use in particular circumstances as well. If we look at our first type, which is an open supplier selection process, this is the most straightforward and simple of which, where you just have a range of qualified applicants and you allow them to bid, present quotes, or present proposals. It's useful when there's a relatively low risk procurement process, so you don't really have much concern around supplier capability, or suppliers have well documented evident capability to fulfill the contract, and or when the focus is primarily on price. As well as price, it could be another single metric that's being measured and another single metric where the majority of the criteria is located. This is different from spot procurement or ad hoc procurement. That's where there is no real supplier selection other than an immediate need and a supplier which comes to mind, or for whatever reason is the obvious candidate. For an open supplier selection type, there will be a range of possible applicants and possible suppliers, and the focus is really allowing them to have a clear documented set of criteria by which they're being judged. But there's no double stages, there's no invitation to tender, there's no negotiation. It's just relatively straightforward. So for that, it really is important that the procurement itself is clearly understood, the specification is known, and there is no ambiguity or confusion or unclear elements to the items or the service being procured. In terms of the actual process of selection itself, that can be done through a range of measures. It can be done on a single metric, so where there's something clear and generic or standard which is being procured. It can be done purely on price, delivery time frame, or another single metric which is chosen. You could use something like a balanced scorecard, which you guys should be familiar with from other areas of project management, where you have a range of weighed criteria. Scores are assigned to each category, generating an overall score that allows you to document exactly what the rationale or the reasoning for choosing one particular supplier is. All in all, however, an open supplier selection process is relatively straightforward, single stage, and should be used when there is no complications foreseen or a particularly straightforward item or service which is being procured. If we move on to the second supplier selection type, which is a restricted supplier selection process, this is a little bit more complex. Here we do have some concerns around either the capability of the supplier. So this is not something which is generic or well understood, but maybe the volume is particularly high, maybe quality concerns are particularly important. So we do have some concerns around capability. And we do also need to shortlist because there's likely to be a very large market response, and using something like a simple balanced scorecard may become very quickly unwieldy because there's so many potential suppliers, that we're either facing a very long process to weigh, use a weighed balanced scorecard for that number of suppliers, or it's likely that many suppliers will achieve the same score, and therefore we need something additional in order to select our supplier. So what we would do is to actually have a two-stage process. The first stage, PQQ in this case, or a pre-qualification questionnaire, where we actually filter out suppliers who do not meet some predetermined set of criteria. So as an example, if we're concerned about the volume which needs to be procured within a short time frame, we could actually filter out suppliers based upon their current capacity, current volume, past order sizes, or some other criteria where we enforce a filtering process. So we send out a pre-qualification questionnaire, and then using those responses, we whittle down to a smaller list. Then that would restrict our ultimate second stage to pre-qualified suppliers, and then we would go out to tender. So then we go back to our tendering process, send out invitations to tender, receive tenders, and then using our criteria select a supplier from those. The ultimate goal of a restricted process really is that we have some concerns over again capability or ability of supplier, and we have a large set of potential suppliers, so we're implementing a two-stage process to eliminate unsuitable suppliers, and then running a second stage in order to choose our ultimate supplier to award our contract to. However, there's still nothing uncertain about the specification or unclear about the item or service that we're procuring. If there is, we can move on to our third supplier selection type, which is a negotiated type. So here we have the same two-stage process, so we'd still filter out suppliers in our first stage using a pre-qualification questionnaire or a pre-qualification checklist, as it's sometimes known. And then in the second stage, instead of having just a straightforward tendering process, we would allow for a direct negotiation. So this obviously means that we have a relatively small number of potential suppliers in the second stage, but we do want direct negotiations in order to have some sort of input from the supplier. Now that's usually creative, artistic, or technical, but the ultimate problem is fairly clear, but the specification may be unclear in some limited capacity. So direct negotiation is useful to firm up the specification, but we should have a relatively reasonable idea of the solution that the procurer is actually looking for. So this is particularly useful for something like a marketing campaign or a logo campaign, or logo creation rather. So in this case, we want some kind of creative or artistic input to help us select a supplier, and that would require a negotiation. That requires a transfer of information and a discussion back and forth between both potential supplier and procurer. So we have a degree of clarity which is required, and that requires a two-way discussion, but otherwise it's a fairly similar two-stage process. If we move on to a competitive dialogue, we can see here that if our specification is not just unclear in some respects, so for a marketing campaign we should already be well aware of our segmentation policy, the target segment we're looking at. We should be aware of our overall marketing strategy, but we just need some creative or artistic input. Here we have real uncertainty, or in a process where actually we have some real uncertainty about what the overall solution is going to be. So we don't just need some creative, artistic, or technical input. We need a real understanding of what the overall solution actually is. There may be multiple different potential solutions, so we don't just need a negotiation, we don't just need some form of creative or technical input, but we need a far more of a real dialogue to craft a particular solution. So instead of using a negotiated process, we'd use a competitive dialogue process. Now, the first stage, again, a two-stage process. So the first stage would be the same as ever. We want to whittle down and pre-qualify suppliers, eliminate potential suppliers which are not suitable, don't have capacity, don't have track record, or anything else which is unsuitable. And then we move on to the second stage, where we actually have a direct dialogue with suppliers, leading to a refined specification, invitation to tender, and then receiving the tenders and selecting a supplier from amongst those that have submitted tenders. So this would be useful for a complex situation where you have a clear problem, but there may be multiple different potential solutions, and you really do need to rely on supplier expertise to evaluate and select one of those solutions, and then that should be built into your specification itself. So we're not looking for some creative or artistic input. We're actually looking for a dialogue with the potential suppliers to help us identify and craft a solution to the procurement problem that we're facing. So this will be not used for things like say a marketing campaign or designing a logo, where a negotiated process will be far more suitable, but rather something like a new facility or expanding capacity, or something where there is a multiple set of potential solutions which could potentially solve our procurement problem. But we're leaning on supplier expertise to help us develop that. So we have this competitive dialogue with multiple pre-qualified suppliers in order for us to refine and develop our specification. So unlike open, restricted, or negotiated processes with a competitive dialogue, you wouldn't expect to have a detailed specification, but rather you would only have a firm understanding of the procurement problem or the procurement need, but you need to actually enter into a dialogue in order to develop your specification during the supplier selection process before that's firmed up and then goes out to tender. Our fifth and last type of supplier selection framework is supplier selection type is a framework agreement, and this is particularly commonly used in public sector procurement because it really has multiple benefits. So it establishes a long-term relationship with not just a single supplier but a range of suppliers, and allows the procurer to have an accelerated time frame when it comes to procuring items or services without having to go through a full tendering process. So we establish a framework agreement with a range of suppliers, and then that allows us to use either a call-off or a mini competition or some other form of accelerated supplier selection from within the framework when goods and services are required immediately. So we've already done some of the hard work when it comes to qualifying these suppliers, locking them into a particular framework, perhaps having specific quality or price agreements in place. So we have done part of the negotiating towards a contract, and then we would have at a second stage as and when we actually need to actually procure and take receipt of goods and services. So it is a two-stage process, but these stages are not necessarily contingent. It's not a case of stage one running over a few weeks and then stage two happening immediately afterwards. Stage one would run in order to establish the framework. So here you'd have an open or restricted procedure to actually establish the framework agreement, establishing a panel or a group of suppliers that are included within the framework agreement. So we have a discussion about the quality or price requirements or anything else, capability assessments and qualifications needed. And then stage two only occurs when we actually need the goods and services, and that may be something which happens on a recurring or a frequent basis. Commonly, we'll see stage two occurring when some element within the procurer needs particular goods and services. So it may be an association of local bodies, it may be individual departments, it may be different locations. So stage two will occur maybe multiple times and at different time frames when the actual goods and services are required.